South CT. If you've never been here before, my name's Josh. I'm normally the guy that teaches. Sometimes other people sub in, but yeah, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 11. We've made it about halfway through, not even actually. There's actually 50 chapters in Genesis, so we've made it, a fifth of the way through the book of Genesis. We're going to start dealing with it in larger chunks beginning next week. But tonight we're going to go over just one really unique story. We're going to be talking about something called the Tower of Babel. Now, if you've been with us the last couple weeks, last week we talked about Noah and the Great Flood and what that event meant. We tried to establish the historical reliability of that event, but also we talked about what it meant, and we addressed the moral issues associated with why God initiated something like that. But we're skipping chapters 8, 9, and 10 for the most part and going straight to chapter 11. Quick recap of those few chapters. Noah gets completely plastered. There's a whole chapter about that. He gets super drunk. That happens. And then after that, we just find out that he has a really dysfunctional family, despite everything else. And so that's kind of what happens in those few chapters. You're welcome to go back and read it for yourself. But the story shifts when we get to Genesis chapter 11. We leave the family of Noah, and we kind of move back to this bird's eye view of society as a whole. We read that now the world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar, and they settled there. So we see this picture of a unified world, a unified culture, rebuilding after the apocalypse, essentially. The flood was destructive. Only Noah's family survived what happened in at least this area of the ancient Near East, if not the world. And so the world is rebuilding, but they've got a common language and a common speech. This is like some We Are the World type stuff, right? This is kind of cool. People coming together to build a society. And they said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. So not only are they unified, but they are also becoming technologically advanced. We may not look at bricks and think like, what a marvel of modern engineering. But in actuality, if you think about it, when people had to take stones to make buildings and fashion each individual stone, that took a long freaking time. Once they were able to mass produce something like bricks, all of a sudden you could start mass producing structures at a much faster rate. And so the invention of things like bricks is what made it possible for people to literally begin building things like cities and not just living in caves or wooden huts and things like that. And so they are an advanced society technologically, they're unified, they're powerful, and they said, "Come and let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered over the face of the whole earth." And so, like a lot of great societies throughout history, these guys want to build a monument to their success. They're like, look at all that we've done and all that we've accomplished. And this is something which great societies, successful societies throughout time have all done. You think of the Eiffel Tower, you think of the Great Pyramids, you think of Mount Rushmore. Some are cooler than others. I would way rather have a pyramid than Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore kind of sucks, if you've ever been there. But the point is that societies like to build monuments to their own power and to their own success. This is kind of just a general attribute of human society. Now, what they were building was probably not actually some million-story tower, like some ancient skyscraper that reached to the heavens. This phrase, "to reach to the heavens," was more of a religious, was a term that had more religious significance. They would build these things called ziggurats in the ancient world, which was kind of like a pre-pyramid type structure. It didn't take quite as much engineering, but this is like an excavated sort of base of what a ziggurat looked like. And the wider they were, the bigger that they could be. But these were literally considered to be access points to heaven in the sense that they were these grand temples from which they would worship their pantheons of gods. And so they're building this massive, magnificent temple that they say is going to reach to the heaven. It's going to take us, human beings, and it's going to put us right up there with the gods. That's basically what they're saying. Now, just like with the flood, there's actually some historical reasons to think that this actually happened at some point. Gleason Archer is kind of like the OG of Old Testament, ancient Near Eastern language studies and whatnot. And commenting on this, he talks about this discovery of this massive stone pillar that was from a period after this time, where this king recorded that the construction of this tower highly offended all the gods. And in a night, they threw down what man had built and impeded their progress, and they were scattered abroad, and their speech became strange. So that's actually pretty similar to what happens in this story. It's not exactly the same thing, but kind of like with those different flood stories, you got to wonder, is it a common memory of something that actually happened at some point? That's one of the things that's unique about the Bible, is that we can actually dig into archaeology and throughout time in the ancient Near East, throughout the cradle of civilization, we find all these small and large things that correlate with what the Bible teaches. It's one of the things that causes us to take the Bible seriously, not just as this weird mythological text, but something which is actually rooted in the pages of history. Well, but then we read the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. Okay, so this language here is a little bit strange. The Lord came down to see the city. Like what? Could he not see it because it was cloudy? Like, what made it that he had to come down and see it? But this is an example of something that we actually see throughout the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. It's use of what we call anthropomorphic language. Anthropomorphic means to take something that's not human and describe it or depict it like it is human. The most common way we see this is in like cartoons. Sloths don't actually wear office clothing, they don't talk, but we anthropomorphize, when we put them into a cartoon or something like that. But that's an anthropomorphization up from an animal. But when we talk about God, we're kind of anthropomorphizing down because God is so much more vast and more complex than people. He's an infinite being. He's all-knowing, he's all-powerful. And so what language do you use to describe God's experience of the world? We're forced to use these human descriptions that fall short of how God must actually experience things, but it's honestly just the best that we can do. And because God wants to be known by us, He uses anthropomorphic language at times when describing himself. And so we'd be wrong to read this and be like, God can't see through clouds. I don't think that's what this means. But the Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language, they've begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. Okay, so what is God doing here? He says, I'm going to go confuse their language. He's looking at what they've built, and he says, if they do this, what else could they do? It's like he's a petty little kid. Like, do any of you guys, do you have older siblings, and do you remember going and destroying their block creations and stuff as a kid? My kids do that. I've got a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old. My 4-year-old will spend all this time building this really intricate Duplo or block creation, and then my 1-year-old just watches and watches and watches, and as soon as it does certain heights, she's like, ha ha, and throws her body on top of it. So is God petty? Is God just flexing on these people? It reminded me of this montage of Kevin Durant. Gotta check this out. I love how it's the same kid for half the video, so he just keeps blocking the kid over and over and over again. If you need another reason to hate KD, there you go. I was already not that much of a fan, but But yeah, so is this what God is doing? Is he like the big man just beating up on the small guy, right? Just, he can't stand to see someone else be successful, and so he just goes in and has to wreck what these guys are doing. Well, let's think about that for a moment. Think about this. Have unified, powerful, and technologically advanced societies always been a good thing? I can think of a few negative examples throughout the course of history that would have fit this description. Unified, speaking the same language, strong in culture, technologically advanced. I don't know. I don't think it's always a good thing. There's a few different examples of this going wrong, both, imaginary but also real. And so when we think about the values of the ancient world, we think of what we see different powerful ancient societies do. If you look at the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, these nations, these ancient nations, enslaved people. They brutalized people. When they had power, when they had dominance, they often used it to do terrible things. And so we kind of had this idea that when people unite, they unite to do good things. Like if you're uniting, it's for a good purpose. But the reality is, historically speaking, when people unite, it's often to do evil. And so while the narrative doesn't tell us exactly why it is that God is like, this cannot go forward, it doesn't tell us exactly why. If we zoom out and look at history, we don't have to speculate that much as to why God felt like this was something which, needed to be interrupted. And so this is one of those rare places where God steps in and he changes the course of history with a supernatural act. And that's exactly what we see him do. So the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. And that is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world, and from there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. And so we see that God was really against something about this nation of Babel. There was something about them that was just completely opposite to the program of God. And if you guys were with us in the book of Revelation, when we were studying Revelation, we talked a lot about God's ultimate design for the world. What God wants to do for humanity. His plan for the world, it culminates in the book of Revelation, right? And so, to take us back there for a moment, if you guys remember, God does want unity. He does want us to be together and to be unified, but he also values diversity. We saw in Revelation 7 how it's people of all nations and all tongues, all languages, all backgrounds together worshiping God, but they retain their individuality. We don't just meld into one cultural whole, but we remain distinct in the ways that God has made us to be different, made us to be special. That's a good thing. We also see that while the people of Babel wanted to build a city to God, to be like God, we see in Revelation that God brings the city of heaven to earth. It's not that we merit, and make our way up to him, but that he comes down to us. That's something fundamental about God, is that he meets us where we're at. We also see that they wanted to make a name for themselves. They wanted to be great and to be known throughout all time, but we see that God is the one who really confers real glory and real power to people. He's the one who gives us a name. He's the one true basis of an identity that's not based on our accomplishments in the here and now, but it's something different, and it's something eternal, it's something real. And so we can see how God's program is very different than Babel's program. And the main thing about Babel that we see confronted here, the thing that God seems, just like he's compelled to go in and do something about, is that they were characterized by autonomous human pride. They talk about how they want to be great. They wanted to reach the heavens, and they wanted to make a name for themselves. And autonomous human pride is actually a really big deal. It's something which God is in opposition to, and this is something which keeps people far away from God. Now, the word pride is kind of a confusing word, because when we think of pride, we often think like, well, what? Am I not supposed to be proud of some things? Like I'm pretty good at basketball. Can I not be proud of that? Yeah, it's okay to be pleased with your own accomplishments, but autonomous human pride is something different. This is a self-sufficient and rebellious attitude. This is an attitude where we put ourselves as entitled and as deserving, and we use this to then not only feel good about what we've done, but we use it to look down on other people. We might even use it to abuse other people. And we certainly use it as a justification for ignoring the God who made us and the God to whom we are actually accountable in this life. And that's the thing that God is so against. If you go back to Genesis chapter 3, we read that this is actually the thing that caused us to reject God in the first place, was that we were like, we can be like God. We don't need God because we can be our own gods. This is the snake speaking to Eve. He says, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God. So that idea that, I can be my own moral authority, that I can be my own source of significance, and that, I don't need God, that's the very thing that led us to rebel in the first place. That's how we got to Babel in the first place. Another issue with autonomous human pride is that it blinds us to our own foolishness and our own evil. And this plays out in a macro way in society and also in a micro way in relationships. This is Yuval Harari. What a name, right? He's an Israeli intellectual. He's also an atheist, but he has this really interesting insight in his book Sapiens into what humans are like. He says, despite the astonishing things the humans are capable of doing, we remain unsure of our goals, and we seem to be as disconnected as ever. We've advanced from canoes to galleys to steamships to space shuttles, but nobody knows where we're going. We are more powerful than ever before, but we have little idea of what to do with all that power. Worse still, humans seem to be more irresponsible than ever. Self-made gods with only the laws of physics to keep us company, we are accountable to no one. We are consequently wreaking havoc on our fellow animals, on the surrounding ecosystem, seeking little more than our own comforts and amusement, yet never finding satisfaction. And then he asks rhetorically, he says, is there anything more dangerous than dissatisfied and irresponsible gods who don't know what they want? I think that's pretty profound. And Harari is thinking about the ways in which we impact the environment with our choices. The way that we impact society as a whole. We, on one hand, with our technology, we are more powerful than we have ever been, but the scope of what we're able to destroy is also greater than it's ever been. And you see that playing out in all these negative ways in society. Now, Harari sees a human solution to this, but obviously, God is proffering something else. He's proffering himself instead as a solution to this. Harari is talking about society as a whole, but like I said, this also plays out in relationships. Just this Sunday, I was hanging out with some friends, and I basically just acted ignorantly, selfishly. I just talked over one of my friends. I acted as if her opinion didn't matter, and I kind of just dismissed her. And it was not only rude. It was very it was mean. It was just totally overriding anything that this person thought. But here's the worst thing about it. I didn't even know that I was doing it. My wife had to point it out to me later. She's like, I can't believe that you were talking like that to her. And here's the thing, sometimes when you realize, well, I didn't know that I was doing it. I didn't mean to. We think that gets us off the hook. But here's the thing. That's actually the problem. The problem is that I can be so proud that I am ignorant to the ways that I am selfish and the ways that I am evil. I can be so proud that I'm so full of myself sometimes that I just don't even think about the effects of what I'm doing. And that itself is the problem. It's not just that, I'm aware of the ways that I hurt other people. Sometimes I am. But the fact that I'm not aware of the ways that I hurt other people has to do with this autonomous human pride. It's in my heart too. It's well and alive. And so that pride blinds us to our evil. It blinds us to our foolishness. Another issue with autonomous human pride is that it edges out humility. And that's a big deal because humility is one of the key ingredients of human happiness. In fact, I would argue that this is one of the main characteristics of a happy person, is that they are a humble person. Humility is also a confusing word. We often think that to be humble means that we're kind of like self-deprecating, like, oh no, I'm not that good at that. When in actuality, it's like, no, you are pretty good at that, right? So humility is not just to, be self-deprecating. It's not to look down on yourself or to not be competitive. I like C.S. Lewis's definition of humility. He says humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. That's well put. It's not that you just adopt this really negative self-perspective. That's not humble. In fact, oftentimes when people do that, we're fishing for compliments, aren't we? When you pretend as if I just suck so much, no one loves me. What you want is someone to be like, no, I love you, right? That's what you want in that moment. You're seeking affirmation. Instead, he says, humility is to think about yourself less. It's to be more preoccupied with loving people and loving God so that I don't just sit around thinking about myself all the time. And man, like I said, this is the pathway to a happy life. Let me give you some reasons why humility is where it's at. For one thing, Jesus himself was humble, and Jesus was the greatest man that ever lived. If we're thinking about, how do we find peace? How do we find fulfillment in this life? We should probably look at Jesus. Jesus was not only the greatest man that ever lived, but he was immeasurably powerful. He was close to God. But yet we're told that one of his key characteristics is that he was meek. He was humble. He didn't put his needs before the needs of others. Even though he was God himself, he loved and served other people. We also see in the Bible that humility is something which God rewards. We read in the book of Proverbs that pride comes before the fall, that pride leads to destruction. The person who puts themselves up on top, that's the person who falls hard. But we read in Matthew 5:5 that it's the meek and the humble who will inherit the earth. They're the ones to whom God will bless and also He will eventually give this world. And so if we want to be protected, if we actually want to be rewarded, then the pathway to that is humility. It's not the path of pride. I also think humility is important because it's just realistic. When we're proud and full of ourselves, when we see ourselves as the center of the world, guess what? We're wrong. Like you may think the world revolves around you. You may think that other people are just objects, that kind of have to do with your happiness and enjoyment of life, and you're wrong. You're completely wrong about that. And so when we live that way, we live out of sync with reality. It's not just spiritual to be humble, it's actually smart to be humble. Because in 1 Corinthians 4:7, God says, "What do you have that you didn't receive?" The things that we're often the most proud of in our lives are the things that honestly we have nothing to do with. Do you think you're attractive? Well, how much of a say did you have in your chromosomes? The answer is 0, right? If we think of the ways in which we're successful at something, oftentimes we are successful not just because we worked hard at it, but because we had an environment that was conducive to that success. We had people who stepped up and helped us be successful in those ways. And so the point is that whatever we have, ultimately, if we go back far enough, it's a gift from God. And so it is realistic to be humble. And that's one reason why we ought to pursue it. Humility is also key to having successful relationships. Think about something like forgiving, or think about something like being able to admit that you're wrong. If you can't do those things, you will never have successful relationships. You will systematically alienate everyone in your life. You might have a girlfriend for a few years or a boyfriend for a few years. You will lose that relationship. You may be married someday. That marriage will fall apart if you cannot learn to forgive, if you cannot learn to admit when you're wrong. And so humility is necessary for successful relationships. And then finally, in Matthew 11, we read that Jesus says, to those who will trust in Him, to those who are humble enough to look to Him, He says, I will give you rest for your souls. And so if we want peace, if we want psychological peace, the pathway to that is humility before God, to be humble enough to admit that we need God. And this leads me to the final reason that autonomous human pride is bad. And it's something that God should take down when He sees it. And it's because it keeps us far away from God. It keeps us far away from Him. It's an exhausting life to try to be something that you're not, right? You ever been in that position? This is my sister Hannah. I'm very proud of her. She's holding my daughter Iris there. And Hannah is a very secure, strong woman. But when she was in high school, Hannah, more so than anyone else that I've ever known, rapidly went through phases where she reinvented herself every 6 to 8 months. Maybe you know what I'm talking about. One year she was goth, and then she was punk, and then she was kind of into hip hop, and it's kind of and then she had this whole year of her life where she was I'm just a really moody artistic person, and would talk like that, and but my sister and my mom are artists, and she kind of postured that way a little bit. But here's the thing, Hannah's not a moody artist. Hannah is a type A driven woman who gets stuff done. That's who she is, okay? And once she was able to accept that part of herself, she experienced a lot more peace in life. She began to be able to wield her personality in a way that was effectual. Now, that's an example of how that works out inside of us. But when it comes to our relationship with God, we try to be something we are not all the time. Namely, we try to be God. We try to be our own source of moral authority. We try to be our own wellspring of meaning. But we are not those things. We can never be those things. It's an exhausting way to live. We are in true need of the forgiveness of God, the love of God, and the power of God. And therefore, God will do what it takes to break human pride so that we will go to Him, the true source of the things that we need. And so what we find in the Bible, and we also find this in our own lives, is that God goes to great lengths to break our pride. In fact, I'm willing to bet that there's some of you here right now where God is, the main thing that God is working on in you right now is He's trying to break down your pride. And He'll use life circumstances. He won't even necessarily initiate them, but He will use life circumstances. Maybe there's a relationship that you've kind of poured your all into. That's your emotional center. It's not going to be sustainable. God may allow that to fail with the hopes that you will turn to Him. Maybe there's things that you take your identity from, like your smarts, maybe your athleticism, and you're starting to realize that that's a comparative thing, and it causes you to be insecure. You're never going to be the best, and so you start to realize, I don't know if I can stake my whole self on this. God will use a realization like that to do away with pride, to bring humility into your life, and therefore joy. And so God will initiate this. He will allow us to fail. He'll speak to us in teachings like this and call on us to humble our hearts before Him. Matthew 23:12 says, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. I find that to be a really challenging verse because we live in a society of self-promotion, right? Everyone's a brand. Everyone's kind of trying to sell themselves in some ways. But God says, whoever exalts themselves will be humbled. Whoever humbles himself will be exalted. You want happiness in life, you want fulfillment, then you need to choose the path of humility before God. 1 Peter 5:5 says, clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but He gives grace to the humble. That's right. So where do we begin? If we want to become humble people, if we don't want to commit the error of the people of Babel, then what do we do? And I think there's a lot that we could say about, becoming humble, about pursuing humility. We'll talk about that at the end of the teaching. But our first step, if you've never taken the step, is to know that humility begins with recognizing your need for God. If you're still there trying to be everything, if you're still there trying to be your all, or even being all for someone else, you're not there yet. It's time to recognize that you need God. There's some of us here who have never recognized in any way that we need God, but if you were to reach out to Him right now and say, God, I need you, then you know what? He would forgive you of your sins. It's possible because Jesus died on the cross in your place so that you could be forgiven. God did that as an act of love for you. If you can admit that you needed that in your life, then that is your first step towards humbling yourself before God. And you'll begin to learn what it means to live a life of humility, but not just, general humility, but a humility that brings you close to your Creator. And then He can help you learn to become and to be everything that He made you to be. And that's what He wants for us. He doesn't just want to wreck our plans. God wants to give us something better. And that's what we see with Babel. It's going to be the story of the Bible, of God thwarting humanity's designs to be something apart from Him, but instead giving us something which is so much better and beyond our wildest dreams. So that's all we have from Genesis 11. I'm going to pray and close this up, and then after I pray, we're going to take some time for discussion. So let me pray for us just real quick. God, we thank You that You are a God who humbles us, who teaches us what it means to be humble. Thank You, Lord, that You're not asking us to be self-deprecating, to look down on ourselves, but instead You're just asking us to recognize reality, that we are not just independent, autonomous beings, but we need You. We need each other and we need You. And there's that might feel unsafe to some of us here, and it is unsafe if we're just doing it with people, God. If we do it with You, it is very safe. And it will lead us to life and it will lead us to love, God. We thank You that You have made this possible, Lord, for us to have a relationship with You through Jesus. And I pray for anyone here who's never made that choice that they would consider calling out to You.